like this.
Unlike their modern counterparts, the Panthers burned gasoline, a highly flammable fuel and a deadly factor in a confined space. Could a fire have taken out Jacques Littlefield's Panther?
You know, originally we thought there had been a fire inside the vehicle, but on the Panther they use wooden blocks that are machined to hold the main gun rounds. And that wood was still intact. And also a large portion of the original wiring for the vehicle, the insulation was still intact, which would imply, because the wood was never burned and the wiring was still in place, that there had been an explosion, but actually no fire.
Dave Marion has redesigned the shattered turret, which is being rebuilt off-site. When completed, the refurbished turret will fit into the turret ring.
Turned out pretty good.
That looks pretty centered?
Yeah.
Fortunately, we were able to find one in France that a collector had that was, I don't know if it was brand new, but it was in very good shape. And the one that, of course, that we'd had was both damaged and very badly rusted. And while you can always rebuild something like that, that would have been quite expensive to do.
With the turret ring in place, next up is the Panther's turret basket. Greg Taylor has been rebuilding the crew seats.
The German armored vehicles all had a standard seat frame. We have one good original seat that we've removed from the 222 armored car. We were able to copy that, and what I did is I made a fixture for the original seat that I could weld up, and we had a bunch of parts made of tubing that we could weld together to make replica seats.
Start.
Man, that is tight.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it works. German precision.
Advanced armor, a powerful gun, and unmatched suspension all made the Panther a masterpiece of war. And that wasn't all. It had an extra gear mechanism, which enabled it to engage in neutral steer. This allowed the Panther's tracks to move in opposite directions at the same time.
The neutral steer on the Panther gives you more maneuverability at low speeds, so it can almost kind of pivot in position. And so all modern vehicles are like that now. The Panther, I guess, was one of the first vehicles to have the neutral steer capability. But you know, the US didn't have that until much later.
For modern tanks like the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams, the Panther's neutral steer legacy is essential. In tank warfare, seconds with your back to the enemy could prove fatal.
Neutral steering means is that you have the ability to turn in place 360 degrees. And in tight spots, specifically in urban areas, where you don't have the ability to go around the corner, turn, and come back, or to do a U-turn, you know, the gun stays on the target while the tank is maneuvering out.
With the turret ring installed, the crew deals with the Panther's final drives. Final drives are gears that transfer power from the transmission to the drive sprockets. But on the Panther, these gears had a serious flaw.
If you look at the actual choice of gears they use basically straight spur gears. They use 3 gears involved, a double reduction system, and straight spur gears, and there's a lot of stress on just one gear tooth when you do that. If you compare that with, for instance, what was used on the Sherman tank, which used basically a set of double herringbone gears with more teeth and more surface area, really the Sherman gears were a better design and a better choice.
The flaw with the Panther's final drives was compounded by the fact that they were designed for a much lighter tank.
The final weight of a Panther is about 45 tons, and they were intended for a vehicle that weighed between 32 and 35 tons. The vehicle continued to get heavier and heavier and heavier as they added more armor, added more components that made it heavy. A common problem in military equipment is that you start out with a component like a final drive that was intended for one weight range, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and then the final drive is a weak point.
To avoid stripping the gears, Panther drivers were ordered to operate at reduced speeds. As a result, the Panther could never reach its full combat potential. And when the tank broke down on the battlefield, the crew was virtually paralyzed by the Panther's complex design.
On the Panther specifically, if you were to have, say, a transmission failure or a final drive failure, it would take days to get down to the final drives because everything, like the driver's seat, all the controls, all that stuff has to be removed before you can get actually to the final drive. The wheels on the Panther are interleaved, and so to get to one inner wheel, you have to take several of the outer wheels off in layers to get down to that one damaged wheel.
And then you had both sets of torsion bars to worry about. They did have access holes so you could get them from either side, but you often had to go to the other side of the tank to have access to push or pull a bar, which meant you had to take off the track and the wheels on the other side of the tank.
The German army fought the war relatively close to home ground. The Americans were fighting an ocean away. So American engineers came up with a time and life-saving concept: rapid field repair.
To remove the transmission on the Panther requires a big crane and disassembling quite a bit of stuff inside. To remove the transmission on a Sherman, for instance, the entire front end comes off so that the transmission and the final drives can come out really quite easily and be put back very easily. So that would really affect your ability to, if you had damage in the front end, to repair that tank in the field.
With lessons learned on the battlefield, rapid field repair is an integral component of modern tank design. Modern propulsion units like MTU's power pack for the German Leopard 2 tank are self-contained. These power packs house the engine, final drives, and transmission all in one unit. Changing engines is literally plug and play. Each day, the crew gets the Panther a little more functional. But they're still no closer to finding out what destroyed their tank over 60 years ago. They know some kind of explosion was involved. Was it sabotage? As the war progressed, German production relied more and more on forced labor. Millions of prisoners were forced to work in German factories. Some would protest through acts of sabotage. During their Panther restoration, Alan and Brian grapple with the final drives. But something doesn't make sense.
The bolts are loose. They've not been tightened up. All the bolts are loose on that cover. Whoever did it didn't do a very good job.
We found all sorts of things, from cigarette butts pushed into oil galleys, holes drilled into oil galleys to lose oil pressure, brake components manufactured in the wrong fashion so that they weren't as useful as they should have been. All manner of things just to slow the war machine up.
Were the final drives on Jack's Panther damaged in an act of sabotage?
I've heard stories and even talked to people who had worked in these factories who talked about, knocking off a gear tooth and then kind of gluing it back on. We haven't seen anything like that that I can point to.
Sabotage is ruled out, but that just raises more questions. In the final months of the war on the bleak Russian front, something Somehow,